Next week is Hanukkah. So I decided I had to make a choice, obviously, because what's happening with current events is very exciting. But I believe that this Hanukkah also could be very exciting. And besides, Hanukkah is a really very important holiday. You know, it seems simple, but the truth is it's tremendously profound in terms of what's happening and so on. So I thought I would speak about Hanukkah this week. Anyway, before I begin, let me just make certain statements. This year should be a blessing and a merit for the health and success of the families of Regina Bas Yosef Reuven and Yeshaya ben Yisrael, Benjamin Wolf, Ben Tzvi Hersh, and Baruch ben Benjamin Wolf, and Shmuel Reuven ben Regina. Right, and they should all have brochas and have a tremendous chus from this year. Also, Esther Liba Bas Chaya Yafa should have a refuah shlema, as well as Shlomo Leib Ben Fego also should have a refuah shlema. In any case, like I said, next week is the holiday of Hanukkah. And I thought Hanukkah is really, like I said, a very important holiday, far more important than I think most people realize, and it's also very joyous. I mean, Klal Yisrael really takes it to heart in terms of get-togethers. It's a tremendous family holiday. But I wanted to go into, obviously, the greater underpinnings of what's really going on and so on, Now, of course, Hanukkah has a very famous story to it. But there's something about Hanukkah, I think you can ask many questions about it. But I would like to ask several questions about it that will dramatize its importance. The first idea, of course, is what is the essence of Hanukkah? I mean, obviously, we make what's called potato latkes, so that's obviously very important, and so on, because of the oil and so on, But this is, a minig that Klal Yisrael does. Then you have donuts and jelly donuts and so on, It's all because of basically the oil that's used to make these things. And Hanukkah, of course, is a holiday that involves a great deal of oil. I mean, that was the miracle of the Hanukkah lights, and so on. So the first question I would ask, there's got to be obviously a much greater essence to Hanukkah. So the question is, what is that? The second question I'd like to ask is, when we look at this story of Hanukkah, we realize something, that the essential story of Hanukkah is where there was an individual, Alexander of Macedon, who was Greek, and he was unusual. He actually fought and he conquered most of the known world at that time. He lived in about, I think, 333 BCE. That's a long time ago. What was unusual about Alexander was that he was very young, but obviously he was considered a tremendous military genius because he was able to conquer so much of the known world. In fact, I think he went all the way from Greece throughout Europe, but into Asia he went all the way up to, I think, India. That's a lot of area that he covered, and he conquered it, And he was very young, and when he finally conquered India and so on, and the whole, basically most of Asia and Europe and so on, he died. He was only 33 years old when he died, which is astounding what he had achieved up to 33 years old, you see. And what Alexander did is something which he is recognized by historians as really one of the major people of world history. What is that? Is that he believed the concept of Greek culture, which is something to talk about and so on. He wanted to modernize, in the language of Greece, it's Hellenize the world. He wanted to introduce modernity in Greek thought, Greek science, Greek philosophy, and so on. And the Greeks were known for their wisdom, for their culture, their architecture, their plays, their literature, and so on. And what he did is, as he conquered each nation, he brought the concept of Hellenization to each of these countries. So in effect, he's one of the greatest figures, and this is what historians consider him, to change the world. He transformed the entire world. That's what he did. And he, like I say, he died when he was 33 years old. But he did succeed in modernizing, certainly at that time, the entire known world. So when you think about that, that's really incredible. But as we know, he wanted to modernize Judaism, Israel. Now, after he died, what happened is that generals took over, because he was died. 4 generals took over, and they took over different parts of his empire. You had Egypt, which was taken over, I think, by Ptolemy. And then there was somebody who took over the Middle East, actually Syria. But Syria was also then in control of Judea. And of course, they wanted to modernize, Hellenize Judea, Eretz Israel, and so on, you know. So he tried to do that. And they fought back. The Jews in Israel, in Judea, they fought back. And they were Moshe Nefesh. And what was astounding is that they won. The historians estimate that there was maybe about 10,000 Jews that fought the Egyptian army, not the Egyptian, the Greek army. And the Greek army, right, they had over 120,000 soldiers. But the interesting thing about that, since they had conquered so much of Asia, they were what's called battle-hardened. They were very experienced because they had fought so many different battles. Yet the Jews won. So really, that is a miracle. In fact, that's the real miracle that took place on Hanukkah. That really, when you consider it, a handful of Jews, right, it's almost like guerrilla warfare, was able to conquering a well-formed, well-positioned army of tremendous soldiers. That was what's called a nes niglo, an open miracle, that they were able to do it. You see. So how come we don't commemorate really anything for the war effort? Because that was the real miracle. So that's another question. And then a third question which I wanted to ask is, what do we commemorate on Hanukkah? Well, what we commemorate on Hanukkah obviously is the miracle of the menorah. Obviously, once they were victorious over the Greeks, they drove them out, and therefore they wanted to rededicate the temple, which the Greeks had defiled by introducing idols and so on. They had defiled, and the Jews wanted to rededicate. And one of the things that they wanted to light was the menorah. Now we know the menorah is one of the instruments, the components of the Beis Hamikdash, you see. And they wanted to, of course, light it. But the problem was is that it would take 8 days to get oil which was not contaminated. The oil was gotten in the Galil, so it would take 4 days to go to the Galil, 4 days back, which is 8 days, in order to get new oil. But they found only one vial left that had the seal of the Kohen Gadol, which means it was pure. Now, 1 day cannot burn 8 days until they got new oil. But they said, listen, we have to do what we can. And of course they lit it. And the miracle was that 1 day's worth of oil burned for 8 days. That's obviously an incredible miracle and so on, you know. But the interesting thing about that is the miracle of the menorah didn't happen at the beginning of the war. It happened 3 years later, after they were victorious and wanted to rededicate the temple. Yet that's what they did. And it burned for 8 days. So it's true, it's an incredible miracle. I mean, it's really a scientific miracle that was impossible, and so on. But the question is, okay, it's a miracle, no question. What does it have to do with Hanukkah? Other than the fact, first of all, it was the menorah in the temple, right? It has nothing to do with Hanukkah per se, but it certainly did occur in Hanukkah, but it occurs 3 years after the victory, after the beginning of the war. So it is true that it's a miracle, but so what? In the sense of, why do we have to celebrate this miracle? Especially, as far as we're concerned, the miracle of the menorah and the celebration of that, by lighting the menorah for 8 days, right? To us, this is the essential idea of the whole Hanukkah. Question is, why? So that's a very important question. What is the menorah's lighting for 8 days really have to do with the essential idea of Hanukkah, which is really the war effort itself, because that was really the miracle. And then the third question I would ask is, you know, the Jews were persecuted and threatened how many times throughout history, right? So how did Chazal know to make this a holiday? Hanukkah is one of the rabbinical holidays, and so on. So how do they know to make this a holiday and not some other miracle that helped the Jews survive, and so on? How do they know when a holiday is appropriate and when it's not appropriate? It's a very important question. What is their guidelines, and so on? So I'd like to give the shir to answer these questions. And they are very important because they really emphasize what Hanukkah really is all about. And that's really what the shir is, this shir is really all about, and so on, you know. Now, one of the things I want to talk about is, I mentioned the story of Hanukkah, which is Alexander, right? And he died at 33 after conquering all Europe. Macedonia conquered Europe, and he conquered Asia all the way to India, you know, which is a very far distance and so on. But what he is known for is his attempt to Hellenize, to modernize the entire world with science and philosophy, logic, so many Aristotle, Socrates. I mean, this is what in fact, the Rebbe, or the teacher of Alexander, was Aristotle. I mean, you can't have a better teacher than Aristotle. You know, he was the greatest, one of probably the greatest minds who ever lived. That's who Aristotle was. So Alexander's teacher was Aristotle, you see. And I'm sure that had a profound effect on Alexander, the fact that his teacher was Aristotle and so on, you know. But in any case, what was his main idea? What is Hellenism really? And that's a very important idea. And how do you contrast, what is the difference between Hellenism, modernity, and Judaism? Because we want to understand, well, what did he introduce that was so dangerous? You know, it's not like he introduced a new car or something like that. You don't go to war because he wanted to introduce, let's say, a new form of transportation. Yet the Greeks want to introduce their philosophy and ideas called Hellenism, and the Jews saw it worthy and appropriate to be Meiser Nefesh, self-sacrifice, and literally go to war, which is, of course, a threat to the entire existence of Judea. Now, it is true that there were many Jews that became Hellenists, They're called the Misyavnim. That is true, that many Jews found the Hellenistic ideas or the Greek way of thinking and so on, culture and all that, to be very attractive. And that is true, and so on. But there were many Jews that obviously said this is wrong, and we do not want to be influenced or taken over by any Hellenistic ideas and so on. And the one who wanted to introduce Hellenism to Israel was somebody, Antiochus Epiphanes, who was one of the people who was in charge of Syria. He took over the Middle East, Syria, which included Judea, Israel, you see. And he wanted to introduce Hellenism. He didn't want to kill the Jews. That wasn't his point. It wasn't the war where he threatened them that they should become slaves. He wanted to introduce a different way of thinking, a different way of life, you see, which is called Hellenism, and so on. So it's very important to understand what this was and why the Jews would, what's called Moshe Nefesh, self-sacrifice to such an extent, would they put their lives at risk in order to reject this Hellenistic culture and so on, And the answer to that is something which is very important, especially when we contrast it with Judaism. And this is really what they fought, you see. What is Hellenism really? What is the essence of Greek thought? The essence of Greek thought is that everything that we see is physical. That means all phenomena is physical. We see the phenomena, true, right? But the cause of the phenomena is physical. There is no spiritual component really to the world. This is what their science taught, right? Their science taught, and their philosophy taught. The concept of that the focus of the world is really physical. And that really explains everything. And it is the job of man to reason out what are the physical underpinnings of reality, you see. And that is ultimately the cause of all effects that we see. And that's really what it is. It's a tremendous emphasis on physicality, materialism, as the essential driving underpinnings of the world itself. Now the Jews hold in many ways the opposite, that not only is there a spiritual universe, which means what's called a meta-universe, there's another dimension of reality that is not physical, it is spiritual, you see? So not only is there another branch of reality called the spiritual, but that branch is the true cause of all phenomena. That's what the Jews believe. We believe in spiritual realities. And I once mentioned, quite a while ago, that there are 7 realities that we believe in as part of the structure, the realities of the entire creation, and so on, So it's not only that we believe in God, a being that is beyond the physical, you see, but we believe that he created different realities. What are they? Well, first of all, there's the reality of the Ein Sof, the infinite one, which is God. We have no idea what that reality is, Ein Sof, but that's the ultimate reality. That is the reality of God, okay, without going into that idea and so on. Okay. Then God and one of the essential ideas of that reality is that in that reality, God is the only thing that exists. In fact, that is reality, existence itself. And God is the only thing that exists at all. And everything else, even ideas, or even the concept of existence, which are concepts, has to be created, right? There is nothing else in that reality outside of God. including concepts and ideas. Even the concept of existence doesn't exist in their reality. Now, we do not understand what that means, but it says, Einoid Mavadoi, besides God, there's nothing else, literally, whether it be objects or concepts. Even the laws of existence, whatever they are, has to be created and so on. So that's the reality of the Ein Sof. Then what God brought in is Zulosoi, others. He actually brought in others, other things that have existence. And that is the reality of the soul, the neshama. And the neshama is the greatest reality, right, after the Ein Sof, after God. A reality that we don't really know or understand, even though we are the souls itself. Of course, someday we will know, but right now we don't. The third reality is the reality called Ruchni, which is spiritual. That is the world of the angels, basically. So that's a third reality that God created. Then the fourth reality, right, is the world of what's called Geshem, materialism. And that is an introduction, or at least the beginning of the introduction, of what? Of physicality. But the world of Geshem, materialism, is not the same physicality that we know of, although it is the beginning of that type of reality. But that reality, then the next reality, is the world where that world of Geshem, materialism, has the possibility of evil. It has the potential of evil, which is known as Zoyama. Zoyama is a force that can be projected by angel, the Satan, and that is a force of evil. But it's only in potential. And Adam, Horishan, the first man, was placed in that reality. The reality that he was placed in, Gan Eden it's called, right, is the reality where it's physical, but not the physicality that we understand, but it has the potential of Zoyama in it. Whereas the previous reality, which I mentioned is the reality of physicality, has no Zoyama, has no potential of evil in it. So obviously that's a superimposed idea on the reality of Geshem. Okay. Then you have the reality after the sin of Adam, Adam sinned, and that is a reality of Geshem that actually became mixed with Zoyama. So you now have a reality that you have both. You have Zoyama, you have Geshem, which is materialism, together with evil. They now exist in the same reality. You see? So then you have the reality of only Zoyama, and that is called Sitra Achra, the other side. You see? So I have just gone through 7 different realities. And what God wants ultimately, right, what he wants is for mankind, specifically the Jewish people, to transform all the realities into a higher one, you see, and finally we will wind up in the reality of what's called the Zulosoi, purely, no more physical, no more spiritual, you see, forget about Zoyama, that's gone, all of that is gone, and we will be only in the reality called Zulosoi, an other, and that reality is Ilam Haba, the future world. And God wants the Jewish people, the descendants of Adam, to transform all the realities into higher ones, you see. So that's what God wants, you see. So obviously what the Jews believe is realities beyond the physical. I mean, what a difference between Greek science or Greek philosophy and Judaism, you know, where the Greeks believe basically only in the physical, and the causes that they look for is all physical, you see. Whereas the Jews believe in a reality of spirituality even higher, and that is the ultimate cause of the physical universe. What a difference. And obviously, based on that difference, you're going to conduct your life very differently. How is that so? And that's why the next thing we have to look at is God's plan. What is his plan? Now that you have this understanding of the difference between Hellenism and Judaism. I mean, they're obviously two countercultures, two different belief systems, which are radically different, you see. And obviously, the Beis HaMikdash, the temple, right, is a reality where we serve God, and the Beis HaMikdash is what? Is the residence of the Shekhinah, which is the divine presence, which is completely different, anathema, to the Greek reality, you see. In any case, and now we come to God's plan. What is important to know is tikkun. God's plan is tikkun. Tikkun means to correct, to repair, to restore, to rectify. You see, so even though God ultimately created different realities, he does not want that to remain for eternity. He wants the Jewish people, now that's who it is, to transform or to reverse the different realities from the lowest, right, which is Geshem, as far as we're concerned, Geshem, which is materiality, physicality, all the way up to the reality of the soul, which is Zulosoi, you see, and that is the reality of, in many ways, divinity, you know, and from there we will exist eternally, and that's supposed to be the greatest reality of all, you see. So tikkun is what God wants. In other words, and how does it happen? Well, how do we rectify creation? And the answer is Ein Sof, God. We need to bring the power of God or the influence God down to this world. That's really what it is. And we say that in the Shmoneh Esrei, Hamachzir Shchinosai L'Tzion, who restores the divine presence to Zion. What does that mean? That's the tikkun. You see, we want to bring the divine presence, the power of the divine presence, the power of the Ein Sof into this world. And that will automatically transform the physical world higher, higher, higher. And it goes up. And that takes time. So it goes from physicality, gets rid of the Zoyama, of the Satan, right? And so on. And then becomes spiritual. And from spiritual it goes higher. And finally it winds up or transforms this physical world into the world of Zulosoi, which is the future world, Olam Haba. In a nutshell, that's really what God wants. He wants to come back to this reality. Not that he ever left, of course he didn't, but he doesn't allow us to perceive him. God is perceived in the spiritual realities of the angels, you know, at whatever level that is. In our reality, we do not perceive him. There was a time that we could feel something of his presence, Shekhinah, but not today, and so on. So he wants to come back and change the realities. Okay, so the question is, how are you going to do it? And of course, I'm not going to go into it because it's a Hanukkah shir, but we need what's called a switch, a trigger. You know, we need a switch that will bring the Ein Sof down and allow the power of the Ein Sof to retransform the different realities into the highest. Well, what are the triggers? And the answer is, that's the Torah. It's really what it is. The 613 commandments are basically 613 triggers, right? And each mitzvah corresponds to different areas of the universe, you see. And when the Jews do the mitzvahs, it allows entry of the divine presence into different areas of the universe. And when the entry is sufficient or total, all of a sudden the entire physical universe is transformed into a spiritual and so on, and goes retransformed. So the mitzvahs are really what? They are triggers that brings down the shefa, the influence or the power of the Ein Sof. That's really the divine plan in a nutshell. I realize it sounds simple, but obviously it's enormously complex. But that's really what it is. As such, therefore, he gave the Jewish people Matan Torah. The Jews left Egypt. They went to the Mount Sinai. At Mount Sinai, they received the Torah. Now, what is interesting, which is very important, is that the Torah, now, there are different perceptions or insights into realities, you see. So the Torah that was given at Mount Sinai initially, before the sin of the golden calf, was what's called the Nun Shari Bina, was the Messianic reality, the Messianic insight, you see, that the Jews realized. Because Moshe Rabbeinu was really the Mashiach ben Yosef. And they had succeeded in bringing the Shekhinah down totally because of the travails of Egypt. Without going into the whole story, you'd have to look at my Shir and Pesach and so on. I think there's 6 of them, whatever. You see? So it comes out that they had Mesakein. They had done the Tikkun, right? Which is astounding. And therefore, the Torah that was given at Matan Torah, right, would be the Torah that would actually have transformed the world really into the Messianic era, with Moshe Rabbeinu being the Messiah, the son of Joseph. That's really what it was, you see. But what God wanted is that they should accept it, because the last test, and we're always tested, God creates a test. He wants to see what we will do. Will we observe his commandments, his mitzvahs, or not? And if we observe his commandments, then we introduce the divine energy into the creation. And ultimately, if all the Jews introduce all the divine energy, the world changes. Well, apparently that's what they had done at Matan Torah, at the giving of the Torah. You see, so he wanted the Jews to accept the Torah lovingly, out of love, and they did. They said Nasa v'nishma, which was incredible. Nasa v'nishma means we will do, v'nishma, and then we will understand. The Jews were willing to accept the Torah, all right? We will accept it, even though we don't understand it. Now you could explain to us. But that was a superlative, right? Acceptance. However, they had to be tested on something else besides the Taryag. What is that? You have to remember one thing. A very cardinal idea is that whatever you're going to receive as a reward, that has to be the nature of the test that you get. And then if you pass, then measure for measure, you will get that reward. Well, if the reward that they were going to get is a transformation through the accepting the Torah, if that the reward would be the Messianic light, then you have to be tested on the Messianic light. Right? That makes sense. Well, what does the Messianic light say? The Messianic light says that what? That the only thing that exists, Einoi Mavado, is God. And therefore, what does that mean, God is the only thing that exists? It means not only you cannot represent him with that there's no other God. That's obvious. There is no other God. There's nothing else. Certainly no other deity, right? But it's not only that. You cannot even represent him with any physical object. That's why Jews have no object that represents God in the synagogue. God is not represented by any physical symbol or object or whatever, because that's part of the Messianic light. And they were tested on that. With what? With the eagle, the golden calf. So what God did, which is interesting, is he set up a scenario where Moshe Rabbeinu said he's coming back at a certain time, and he didn't. He was late, or rather really was on time, but it was a cloudy day, and they misinterpreted that Moshe Rabbeinu should have been here, but he wasn't because they misinterpreted the time. Why did God do that? Because he wanted to see, well, what's going to happen? Are the Jews going to get frightened that Moshe Rabbeinu is gone? And will they now make some type of not an idol that they believed in as God, but something that's going to represent God? Is that what they're going to do? Which is the opposite or contrary to the Messianic light. You see, now what is interesting is that they realize God is the only thing that exists. In fact, Rashi says, what is the major revelation of Sinai? So Rashi says, it says, Ato Horeis Ladas, you have been shown that you may know, right? Ki Hashem Elokim, that God is Elokim, the Master, the Lord. Einod Muvadoi. Besides God, there's nothing else. It doesn't say, it says there's nothing else. It doesn't say there's nobody like God. It says there's nobody but God. You see, so Rashi says, what did God reveal to them? And that's how we know it's the Messianic light. What God did is he opened up the heavens. That's what it says. He opened up the heavens and he showed the Jews, Rashi's expression is, Shehu Yechudei Shel Olam. He's the only thing that is. He actually in some way showed them. That's a beyond belief demonstration of God, because he revealed that aspect of who he is, that he's the only thing that exists. And he did that. That was the revelation of Sinai. You see, in fact, that was the main revelation. Einod Muvadoi. Besides God, there is nobody but him. Not like him, but him. So he actually revealed that to the Jews. What is that? That is the Messianic light, you see. And then he set up the Jews that they could make this mistake. Well, Moshe Rabbeinu is not coming back, so what do? So there were several thousand Jews, whatever, that decided, well, we need a representation of God. But wait a minute, you can't do that. You just basically saw. But the problem is, you could take the Jews out of Egypt, but it's very hard to take Egypt out of the Jews, you see. And the Jews were fooled, or rather they were so habituated to believe in idolatry and so on, that at least there's got to be some way of representing God symbolically, and they built a golden calf. As a result of that, of course, they destroyed the ability of Moshe Rabbeinu to be the Mashiach ben Yosef. And the Luchas Rishonis, the first tablets, what were they? They were really the mitzvahs in the form of reward, in the form of understanding how they are the triggers. Where the Jews looked at each mitzvah and realized, what is it as a trigger in the upper worlds? Because that's really what the mitzvahs are. You see, that was the Luchas Rishonis. That was the what? The first tablets. But once they did the sin of the golden calf, they no longer could be privy to that insight into the mitzvahs, how exactly each mitzvah is a trigger of some area of the creation itself. What a view. I'm skipping a lot of ideas, obviously, but I'm giving you a bird's eye view of really what's happening. So God said, you can no longer. So Moshe Rabbeinu did what he had to do. He took the Luchas Rishonis, the first tablets, and he threw them down at the bottom of the mountain. And as a result of that, they broke, shattered, and so on. So the Jews did gather the pieces and put them in the Oron, the ark itself, and so on. But they no longer could view the mitzvahs in that fashion as the insight of the Messianic light. Exactly how the mitzvahs are a trigger and how they interface with the mechanism, which is the Kabbalistic understanding of the entire creation. You see, now we have the mitzvahs as a trigger without knowing why it's a trigger. I always say it's like, imagine walking into a house, right? And you see there's a switch on the wall, all right? So you can walk in a house, and if the house is being built, you can actually see that it's a trigger, a switch, but you could see the wires, the cables running, right, to what's called a load. So you actually see how this light switch will open up a light. But imagine walking into a house, right? There's a switch on the wall, you flip open the switch, nothing happens. So you figure, well, why would they put a switch in a house and nothing happens? And the obviously answer is, well, of course something happened, except you don't know what happened. Oh, well, that was the situation of the Jews after the sin of the golden calf. You see, now, the problem was, and here's where you begin the problem. So what was destroyed because of the sin of the golden calf? What was destroyed was the ability of Moshe Rabbeinu to be the Messiah, Mashiach ben Yosef. That's the Messianic era, you see. And one of the main people, who was one of the main people contributed? Well, the one who gave the Jews the ability to create a golden calf, right, was Aaron HaKohen. Aaron, the Kohen. He gave them the amulet or whatever he gave them that allowed them to throw it into the fire and out popped an egel. You see? So in certain ways, Aaron was one of the major aider and abetter of the sin of the golden calf, even though he couldn't help himself because they threatened him with death. And therefore he said, no, I don't want to die, so I have to do that. In any case, you see, so the test of the egel was a test that would have allowed them to receive the 50 gate of wisdom, but since they sinned, it never happened. And like I said, Aaron HaKohen, was one of the major ideas, you see. Now, Aaron was devastated because he realized what that meant. And that's why it says that all the Shvatim, the tribes, were asked to bring korbanos, offerings, at the dedication of the temple, but not Aaron. So it says in Bahaloischo that Aaron had tremendous chalisha. He wanted to faint because he figured that the God never forgave him for helping the Jews do the golden calf, which destroyed the ability of Moshe Rabbeinu, his brother, to be Mashiach ben Yosef, right? So he was devastated. And of course he repented for whatever, but it really wasn't his fault. Like I said, he was threatened with death. So God says to him, don't worry, I have forgiven you. And even though you're going to say, well, even if you forgive me, but look what I did. Well, look at the consequences of my actions. So God told him something very, very interesting. And with this, we begin to understand what Hanukkah really is. You should know one thing which I find always very interesting. There is always an answer somewhere in the Talmud, right, what the essence of every holiday is. The problem is, many times it's hidden. Well, guess what? The answer is in this medrash, in Bahaloischo, where God appears to Aaron HaKohen, and he says to him, don't worry, your descendant who will emerge from you will be responsible for the tikkun of the damage that the Jews did and that what you did by them not accepting, by them building a golden calf. Right. And in that way, you will have the tikkun. That's what God said to Aaron HaKohen. And therefore, Aaron HaKohen was mollified. He said, okay, that means one of my descendants will restore what's called the Kabbalah Torah of the Orishim, the accepting of the Torah of the Messianic light. All right. That's what God said to Aaron HaKohen. And this, obviously, is a very important idea. And this, therefore, is the origin of Hanukkah. We can now see something amazing. We look at history, and history is nothing more than the progression, basically, of human events. That's really what history is. But we ask ourselves, what determines human events? Now, of course, there are reasons known to historians. There are military ideas, reasons, right? Cultural ideas, scientific forces, right? And political forces and so on. Well, this is what determines the events of human history and so on. Wrong. The only thing that determines human history, of which we will someday understand, is the advancement of tikkun. Right. God wants to come back and do the tikkun. Therefore, he subjects the Jews and also the world, by the way, to myriad types of tests that they have to pass. The Jews have to pass the test of the Taryag mitzvahs, which I said is the trigger. And even the Goyim have tests. What are theirs? The 7 Noachide laws. They are also tested to see if they will also inherit Olam Haba, which they can if they observe the 7 Noachide laws. But what's interesting is they have to observe it because they believe it was given by God, not because it's humane or good for mankind. No, they have to observe it because it was given by God. But without getting into that, therefore mankind is always tested. Now, we don't understand the nature of the test, why this type of test. God does. And every single human situation, I don't care how small it is, it doesn't make a difference. Each thing is a test that in some way will allow God to come back into the world. Even by the Jews. By the Jews, if they do the test correctly, then they bring the Ein Sof, God, back into the universe. A Goy cannot have that power unless he becomes Jewish. But what he can do is affect his own mazel to get Olam Haba. But they both have consequences, you see. So as a result of this, right, God will subject mankind, especially the Jews, to advance the tikkun process. That's really what we're looking at. And the secret of human history, and of course, is what? Is the advancement of the tikkun process. But of course, God shapes history to what looks like physical reasons, political reasons, scientific reasons, and so on. That's how it looks. So that's the way historians interpret it. But really, it's the tikkun. And in order to understand the tikkun process, by the way, you must study the divine plan, right? If you do not know the divine plan, you'll never figure it out. And you can't figure it out by studying or reading the New York Times, or the Washington Times, or any of these things and so on. Newspapers don't know. Nobody knows. The only one who can figure out, maybe sometime, is somebody who studies the divine plan. I'm telling you the secret of how to penetrate this mystery. And even then, it's limited what you could see, and so on. And I have extensively spoken about many, many historical events from the standpoint of the perspective of the divine plan. And I am now giving you the perspective of the divine plan of Alexander of Macedon. Right, you'll now understand why, at least to a certain extent, why God made Alexander so successful. Alexander doesn't have the ability to do this, but God wanted him to do it. Why? Because he wanted the Jews to undo the sin of the golden calf, that they would accept the Messianic light with love and Messiah's nefesh. How does he do it? So God is, so to speak, right? So remember, God wants to rectify the pagam, the damage, the defect of the mistake of not accepting the Messianic light with love and with totality and so on. So how did he do that? Well, remember what the Jews did by the golden calf. They rejected, by building a golden calf, the Messianic understanding that there is nothing that can represent God at all. I mean, even if you don't believe that that is a deity, and the Jews didn't believe that the calf was a deity, how could they after what they witnessed in Egypt? But they did believe that it could represent God, and maybe to a certain extent, it could be given powers by God or whatever, you see. And of course the whole thing is false. But whatever it is, the Jews had to undo it. So how did he do it? So now we come to the understanding of an incredible historical event. Where's the origin of this event? The origin is in the second pasuk of Bereshis. It says, "V'ha'oretz hayis soyu v'voyu," and the earth was soyu v'voyu, unformed. Voyu means void, empty. V'choshech, and darkness, apnei sahoim, was on the face of the deep. You see? And then it says, "Vayomer Elokim, ruach Elokim rachefes apnei hamoyim," and the Spirit of God hovers over the face of the waters. And then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Fine. That's the second pasuk in Bereshis. And the Chazal talk about that pasuk. Who is Soyu, Voyu, and Choshech, and Penoim? Well, Soyu represents Babylon. It represents the four empires that will subjugate the Jews, without going into it. So Soyu represents Babylon. Voyu represents Persia. Choshech, darkness, right, represents Greece. And Apnei Sahoim, the abyss, represents Rome. Okay, let's take a look at Choshech, darkness. How could Greece be darkness? Greece, which is under Hellenism and, modernity and so on, philosophy and science, how in the world can they be what? Darkness. They introduced an enormous amount of light, modernity, right? Advanced civilization. Why would the Torah call them dark? And the answer is, well, what does it say right after that? And God said, "Let there be light." And the Medrash says, what was that light? It wasn't the light that we understand where you're able to see things. No, the light means insight. God said, "Let there be light." It means let there be insight into who I am, that everything is created by me. That is the Messianic light. And then God took away that perception on the second day, without getting into that. So that light was the Messianic light, where you could see how God runs the universe, that everything was created from God. He is the ultimate source of everything. That's what it was. Well, if that was the light, then what was the darkness? The darkness was its opposite, which means you would see, the insight you would have is not that God made everything, but that the world has a pnimius. It has an internal structure, internal principle. It has internal causes, but it's darkness. It's physical, right? That choshech is an alternative understanding of the universe, that the universe does have a cause, right? Science is correct. You see, it has underpinnings. And that's really what science is. Everything has underpinnings. And science seeks to seek it out. And it has teferes, beauty, structure. But all of it is physical. None of it is spiritual. And there you are. That's the contrast between choshech and or. Or is the Messianic light, that there's an entire spiritual universe, even more, and so on. And then choshech, darkness, is really light, but it's a light where it denies the true cause of everything, which is spiritual. It is physical. Well, who holds that? That's Greece. So when God says, I want to take the opposite of the Messianic light, and I will allow it to capture the entire world. You see? So I'm setting up the world, besides introducing modernity and so on. But the real reason is I want the world, I want some type of a nation, which came out to be Greece, that will capture this type of insight, and as a result of that, influence the entire world, especially Judea, Israel, right? And then once Israel is captured by Greece, and Greece is going to try to introduce this chokhmah, this wisdom, that really the world is physical, even though it's profound, and that's the ultimate causes, but they are going to be tested. Guess what? That's another test. Will you accept the Messianic light, that everything is spiritual? You see? So what he did is he gave Alexander the power and the hatzlacha, the success, to do what? to capture the entire world. This isn't ordinary. You know, people think Alexander was a genius. Of course he was a genius, because God made him a genius. God wanted him to capture the world so he can subject the Jews to this test. Right. It was a setup. That's how history works. All of history works this way. Except fortunately we can see why it happened by Alexander. Because God needed to set up the Jews for this test so they can reject Greek thought, Greek belief, right? And that would undo the sin of the golden calf. Isn't that interesting? It's fascinating that the whole world was influenced by the need of the Jews to do the tikkun, to undo a sin of the golden calf. And that's what God did. So what happens, which is really, when you think about it, it's really incredible and so on, you know. So Alexander conquers the world, and the setup begins. So Matisioi Kohen Gadol, he fights and he gathers a whole group of people, even though they were very little, and so on. And they fought, they gave their lives to do what? They didn't give their lives because they were being threatened by death. Not at all. That's not what the Greeks wanted. They gave their lives because they said, we reject the philosophy, the belief system of the Greeks, right? We believe in what we believe, which is the world has a complete spiritual structure, a meta-universe, you see. And that is the purpose, to transform one universe ultimately into the future world. And we reject, and they went to war. It's astounding. And they fought the war for many years, you see, and they won. You see, they actually won. Because they believed that the ultimate cause of everything is God. It's spiritual, not physical. Contrary to the Greeks, we now understand something very important, why the whole basic Greek idea started and so on. In any case, why it captured the entire world. Now what's interesting is they merited to win. Why? Imagine 10,000 people are now going to fight with 125,000 battle-hardened army. The Greeks, they were very good. They captured the entire world, right? Imagine if they walk over to a Greek general, right? And they say to him, well, what do you think we should do? You think we should fight the Greeks? So he say, well, basically it's numbers, right? What are your weapons? How many numbers do you have? Well, we have 10,000 guys. Well, how many do the Greeks have? They have over 125,000 soldiers with weapons, battle-hardened. So the general would tell them, what, are you crazy? Apiteva, naturally, you're going to lose. Because wars are basically determined by numbers, especially if those numbers have tremendous amount of prowess. Did the Jews listen? No. They said, we are fighting a war of God. And the one who determines victory is not science, it's not nature, it's not numbers, it is God. And he has no problem. So we are going to give up our lives to fight. And guess what? They won. Why? Measure for measure. Because they believe the cause of all victory, of all human events, is God. So what's the problem? We just have to hope that our merit is sufficient to where God will say, because you believe that I am the cause, you will win. You see? Interesting. Not only that, imagine after 3 years when they started the war, when you had the miracle of the candles. All right? Imagine if they walked over to a Greek scientist and they said to him, well, what do you think we should do? Well, how much oil do you have? The scientist would say, well, we have enough oil for 1 day to burn, right? So the scientist would say, well, how many days do you need to get new oil? Well, we need 8 days to get new oil. Should we burn this oil and maybe it's going to burn for 8 days? So the scientist will say, excuse me, are you okay? Oil which can only burn 1 day cannot have the combustibility to burn 8 days. What are you talking about? So they would say to him, you know, you happen to be right, at least it looks that way. But really, what makes oil burn at whatever rate it does. What makes oil burn altogether? Nobody really knows. They can describe a molecular structure, but they don't know why this structure is combustible. Nobody knows the why of science. They just know the what happens, but nobody knows why, and so on. So the answer to the why is God's command that you have to burn, and you have to burn only a certain amount. You see? So we believe that God determines everything, and we're going to light one day, and maybe the merit of believing that God controls nature, right? Maybe that will help us. Guess what? God said, you're right, and I will do it. Isn't that interesting? So they merited to receive exactly what they did, you see. And that's a very important idea. Now, how do we understand the miracle of the menorah? What does that have to do with the victory? Like I said, and the answer is a very important idea. The Jews did not know really what they had accomplished. They undid the sin of the golden calf. They rectified the defect of not receiving or accepting the Messianic light. How would they know this? They didn't. So God said, I have to tell them what they did, what the true measure of accomplishment was, which is they actually created a new tikkun, a new or, a new light of tikkun, right, in the creation because of what they did, that they self-sacrificed. How am I going to do it? Right? There's no telegram. He can't get, what do you call it, who's the telegram, Westing, or whatever, Westinghouse, whatever, and so on. I can't do that. There's no telegrams, right? I will send him a telegram by actually causing a miracle to happen in the very instrument that represents the Messianic light in the temple. Well, what is that? That's the menorah. So what God did is he allowed the menorah to be rekindled miraculously, because the menorah is the instrument that represents the Messianic light in the Beis HaMikdash. And it did exactly what they did. They rekindled the Messianic light, and therefore the menorah will be rekindled. It's exactly what they did. So when they saw that the menorah was lit with a miracle, 8 days instead of one, they said, how is this possible? They understood it wasn't just a miracle, it was a miracle that was talking to them, right? And said, you know why I'm burning for 8 days? Because 8 is a symbol of the Messianic era, of spirituality, without getting into that and so on, you see. And therefore, we will burn for 8 days, because that's what you did. You rekindled the light of the Kabbalah Torah, and therefore the instrument that represents the Messianic light in the temple will be rekindled. That's the message. It's like the menorah is talking to them. And of course, since Chazal are so incredibly attuned, right, to the divine plan and the divine mysteries, they immediately understood this is not just a war, where we accomplished a great thing, true, but it's not just a victory of a war. We rekindled the pagam, the defect of the Messianic light. That was an unbelievable message. So then they said, well, it's one thing if we reinforce an old light, where something was supposed to happen to the Jews and the Jews were saved. Okay, so that doesn't rekindle a new light. It reinforces, right, an old light. But if you but if you actually initiate a new light that was never done before, that has to be a Yom Tov. And by the way, that's also what happened on Purim, without getting into that, and so on. And therefore they realized we need to create a holiday that celebrates this, the undoing of the sin of the golden calf, the rekindling that we believe in the Messianic light, that there is no such thing as physicality that does anything. It's all about God and the spiritual dimensions. So we are going to do this, right? And that's why we have a holiday of Hanukkah. Isn't that incredible, the way it lines up and so on? And you understand the reason for such an important, significant Greek event and so on, and what Hanukkah really is. Now, wait a minute. There's an old question that is asked. Wait a minute. They had enough light or oil for one day. So the miracle was really for 7, not 8. Because it had enough for one day. So whatever the miracle was, it was only for 7. Because it could burn one day by itself, and so on. So the idea is that one day that we light is for the war effort, right? That's the answer. That one day is because of the war itself. You see, as the victory is the miracle, so we therefore celebrate that one day. The rest of it, which is 7, that's the miracle of the Messianic light, right? Which is fascinating when you think about that. So that answers in many ways the first question, that the war was really the first day we light, and the other 7 days is for the miracle of the menorah. That's why we light altogether 8 days. And it also answers the question of how do we know, why did Chazal know to make the miracle, right, of a holiday? Jews were saved many times. And the answer to that is because they realized through the message of the menorah that we just undid the sin of the golden calf, you see? And therefore, as a result of that, we need to make a Jewish holiday. This is the fascinating story of Hanukkah. What we see here is every human event is because of the tikkun. Except we don't know many times what's going on. But clearly the sin of the golden calf was a defect in the Kabbalah's Torah, in the accepting of the Jewish belief system of the Messianic light, as we will see by Purim also, and so on. Now, you may ask a question and say, wait a minute. If the Jews accepted the Torah with love by giving their Messiah's Nefesh, self-sacrifice, then why didn't the Mashiach come? Why didn't it come? Which is a very good question. And the answer is it could have come, right? Matisiot Kohen Gadol, in many ways, was the Mashiach ben Yosef. He could have been, had the Jews been worthy, you see. Because the one who is Mashiach ben Yosef, basically, right, is either somebody from the tribe of Yosef, but he really could be from any tribe. Only Mashiach ben David has to come from the tribe of David and Yehuda and so on. But Mashiach ben Yosef can come from any tribe. But apparently he always seems to come either from the tribe of Yosef, maybe Binyamin, and he did, Shaul HaMelech was Mashiach ben Yosef, and he came from the tribe of Binyamin. But the Mashiach ben Yosef can also come from who? From Levi. Moshe Rabbeinu, Mashiach ben Yosef, he came from the tribe of Levi. And guess what? Kohanim are also Leviim, right? So therefore, Matisiot could have been. What was the problem? Because they failed. They reintroduced a failure again. What was the failure? Because we know it says, that the Mashiach or the king will come from the tribe of Yehuda. The Sasa Shevet mi Yehuda, that the rod, the scepter of kingship, will not be removed, or depart from the tribe of Yehuda. So therefore, who was the Kohanim? Well, they were temporary, Chashmonoim. Really what should have happened is the Chashmonoim, after winning the Greeks, should have departed the Malchus. They were Kohanim, that's true, but they really should not have been the Melech. They were in temporary, but they did not depart the kingship of Malchus. That was a sin. And since the Messiah in those days could only come through schus, through merit, and not because of be'itoi, which means it has to come at that time, therefore Mashiach could not come. Right. So it comes out the Chashmonoim destroyed a messianic opportunity. That's what happens. And they were severely punished because they were all killed. In fact, the last one was a woman named Miriam. She was the last descendant of the tribe of what? Of the Chashmonoim and so on, which were Kohanim. She was the last one. And Hurdis, Herod, married her, which is because he needed some kind of legitimacy, that he was a king, so he figured he's going to marry a woman from the Chashmonoim, because that's what they were called, right? And they were kings and so on, right? But of course, she said, no way are you going to marry me, and I'm not going to legitimatize your kingship, right? So she committed suicide. I think she threw herself off the roof and committed suicide. And it says that but he needed legitimacy, so he encased her in honey, right? So he preserved her body in honey, right? Because he needed some type of legitimacy and keep her around. You see, he didn't bury her, which is interesting. I always get a kick out of that. Maybe that's why husbands call their wife honey. But anyway, in any case, that's what he did. But God destroyed the house of the Chashmonoim. And not only that, if you'll notice, every holiday has a Gemara, because all holidays have some type of mitzvah. So all of them have a Gemara, a Masechta attached to it. Hanukkah does not. There's no such thing as Masechta Hanukkah. Why? There's Megillah, which is Purim, Pesach, and Shavuos is Kachim, that's why it doesn't have. But you have Sukkah, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and so on. So it says, because Rebbe was very mad at the Chashmonoim. Why? Because they sinned, because they did not give up the kingship. They were not supposed to do that. So he didn't want to honor them by putting all the laws of Hanukkah in a Masechta, in a tractate or a treatise. Instead, he spread it out all through the Mishnayos, not to give honor to the Chashmonoim because they sinned. So the question, what was Rebbe mad about? You see, and the answer is because it wasn't just that they sinned, but they destroyed an opportunity of the Mashiach to come, because they had they had rectified what? The ability of the pagam, the damage to the cheto egel, right? And they therefore sinned. So not only did they all die, Rebbe refused to write a Masechta in their honor. You see, isn't that amazing? This is the sin of the Chashmonoim. But the truth is that it could have been a messianic opportunity, right? Because that's how great is the light of Hanukkah. So what did Chazal do? So Chazal realized, wait a minute, so we need to use the light of Hanukkah, bring the Mashiach, because the Jews did resurrect. Not resurrect, I should say. The Jews did, be masakin, and so on. They repaired the damage, and so on. So Chazal realized, we are now going to have everybody observe Hanukkah, and when you light the Hanukkah lights, guess what? You are contributing to the descent of that ore of the Ein Sof in terms of the Messianic light, right? So we actually rectify what they did through action, we do through the halachas, through the observance of the halachas, right? So all the halachas that we observe in memory and in honor of the removal of the defect of what? Of accepting the Torah with love, we do through the halachas, right? And that's why to this day we observe the Hanukkah lights. And that is why when you light Hanukkah lights, what are you supposed to think about? You are looking at the light of the menorah, which is the light of the menorah in the temple, which is the symbol of the Messianic light, right? That's what the Hanukkah lights are. That's why they say when you light the Hanukkah lights, don't walk away, stare at them for at least a half hour. Because that staring and thinking about this shear, which tells you what it was all about, it contributes to the actual contribution of bringing the Messiah, right? That's the tremendous mitzvah of the Messianic light. And when you really begin to see this, because on a dreidel you have Nun Gimel Hey Shin, on the dreidel which we spin and they used to play, Nun Gimel Hey Shin is Nes Gadol Hoyasham, a great miracle happened there. And the gematria of Nun Gimel Hey Shin is gematria Mashiach. It's funny, somebody once asked me, well, that's good in America. What about Israel? Because there they don't have Shin, Nes Gadol Hoyasham, Nes Gadol Hoyapoi. A great miracle happened here. That doesn't add up to Mashiach. True. So I realized, and the Rebbe was kind to me. He gave me the answer right on the spot. Yes, but Nun Gimel Hey Pei is 138, not 357 or whatever, 358, whatever. It's 137, and that is Gematria Tzemach, the offspring. And that's Es Tzemach David. The offspring of, or the offshoot of David is who? Sheikh ben Yosef. Right, exactly. So even Tzemach is Gematria 138, which is Gematria Tzemach, which is fascinating, that even the Israeli version and so on. But we do see, right, that was a great idea. But one of the things I want to add, which is also very important, is since the Jews destroyed the opportunity, right? What happened when the Jews destroyed the opportunity of the Mashiach? Well, that's what happens. Golus. We go back into Golus. And that is why there were 3 wars with Carthage and Rome. They're called the Punic Wars. Rome was never a world power. Carthage was its equal. And that was the famous Punic Wars with Hannibal and so on. And they were fought. And in 148 was the 3rd Punic War that Rome won over Carthage. And Rome we know as Esav. So the failure of the Jews to bring the Messiah empowered Esav himself, Rome, to become a world power which would ultimately destroy, right, the Beis HaMikdash. And like I say, my thought is that was a result of what the Chashmonaim did. It empowered Esav to create the Golus to destroy the Beis HaMikdash and so on. So therefore, that is what happened. And Rome, of course, was the what? Rome's greatness lies in Greece. Rome was the bearer of Greek civilization. They originated certain ideas, but the real thing they did was they carried on or conveyed the Greek science and philosophy. They are the bearers. The real wisdom was Greece, and Rome just carried it on, you see, which is very important. And I always feel, which is something really which is very interesting, is that, of course, the religion of Rome is what? Became Christianity. And the problem with Christianity is that they physicalized Judaism. That's the problem with Christianity. They made Yeshu into a god, or the Son of God, which is absurd. You can't take God, which is beyond comprehension, which is the only thing that exists, and say he has 3 parts to him, especially the Son, Yeshu. How could you say that? What they are doing essentially is what the Greeks did. They are physically creating a representation of a god as a physical person. That is Greeks. That is exactly what it is. In fact, most of what Christianity is, when you think about it, for those who are familiar with the the Christian rituals, all kinds of rituals that they have, even a Christmas tree is basically a pagan idea that emerges on, you know. What Christianity really is paganism dressed as a Jewish veneer. It's really what it is. A great deal of its rituals are pagan. Why? Because the whole concept of pagan is physical, that all spiritual beings have to really be physical. And that's exactly what they did, you see. So it's an interesting mix where they realize Judaism is supreme because they realize the Torah is the Word of God. But what they did is the Greek heritage, which is what? You got to physicalize it because everything ultimately is physical. So therefore, Christianity in many ways is a very physical religion, you see. And it all results from Hanukkah because the Jews failed to take Hanukkah, you see, and use it as a messianic opportunity. And therefore Rome won against Carthage, and Rome bears the culture and the science and the advancement, civilization advancement of Greece. And ultimately it's Christian, and Christian is a physicalization, really, of spirituality. And this is the great mistake that they make, which will ultimately, by the way, be corrected in the time to come, when they realize that they are right, there is spirituality. Because they also, in many ways, did a lot of interesting work, by the way, because they believe in a future world, they believe in a Messiah, they believe in a redemption. There's a lot of things that they believe, which of course comes from Judaism, and so on. So in that sense, they contributed to the world with that correct information. But what they did is they took on the heritage of Greece, which is to physicalize, right, religion. And if you think about it, for those who are familiar with Greek religion, there's Jupiter, which is Zeus, all these gods running around and so on. There's Jupiter, there's Juno, or Mercury. I don't want to go through all the Greek deities, but if you think about it, what were they really? They were basically super people that were giants, but they were all involved in physical, activities. I mean, Jupiter even went around raping women. I hate to say that, but excuse me, this is what a god does? Yeah, because what they did is same thing. They took their religion and they physicalized it, because that's all they can see. It's always physical, because they cannot understand a deity, a god, that is completely removed from anything physical. Even spiritual God is removed from. They cannot comprehend that. And that's why they have all these images, right? Why does a religion have images? What does Mary have to do with God and so on? How can a woman give birth to a God? This whole thing is pagan and so on, because this is the mistake that they make. Everything is physical, basically, even when you believe in a religion. And I'm telling you what the premise is of Christianity and so on, which is a tragic mistake. And all of this comes from the fact that we failed, the Hashmonaim failed to introduce, right, and so on. And by the way, that's why Hanukkah and Christianity, or Christmas, always comes out together. In fact, this year, something very rare is going to happen. Christmas, Hanukkah will occur on the same night, right? And one is Zeh L'Umat Zeh, where the Rebbe is telling, the world, no. The only religion is a purely spiritual religion. And it's there to contrast it with your religion, which is basically paganism, because that's most of the rituals of Christianity. If you ever search the origin, is basically pagan and so on, you see? And not only that, but Christianity always occurs in the month of Teves, right? December and January. And if you think about it, Teves is the mazel, or the month of Esav, right? Because the mazel, the constellation, the zodiac, is Capricorn, the goat. And the goat is the symbol of Esav. Seir, a goat, that's the symbol of the devil, or the symbol of Esav, which is Teves. And Christianity always comes out in Teves, and so on. And therefore that is the holiday of Esav, and so on, and so on. But this will not always be, and so on. But I'm trying to give you certain ideas which show relationships that really in many ways emerged from Hanukkah. What do we walk away with? We need to understand what Hanukkah really is. Especially, I believe personally that this Hanukkah is a pivotal holiday, this Hanukkah. Why? Because like I said, America is changing, and I believe therefore that America will see a tremendous beginning of a redemption, and that is the beginning of an entry of a Messianic era, which I have dwelt on many times with the whole concept of Trump and so on, So you never know, maybe something significant will happen this Hanukkah, because this Hanukkah, I believe, is happening in the time when God is changing the world's muzzle, that we're getting rid of the Democratic Party, which is evil, and we're coming into a new Tekufa era of a success, but it's going to start off with success, right, of profit, of physicality, and then it will move to righteousness and goodness, ultimately moving to more than spirituality, holiness, and then divinity. Right, I believe we have started that motion. Any case, I hope I have explained Hanukkah in a very different way. You now begin to see the enormous profundity of Jewish holidays and how God unbelievably runs the world. And I've just demonstrated basically the concept. I mean, there's more ideas to it, obviously, because whatever God does is always multi-deterministic and so on. But one of the essential ideas of Greece is to allow the Jews to be tested and to again rectify the sin of the golden calf. Thank you.